Welcome to another episode of Innovation and the Future of Pharmacovigilance, a podcast series brought to you by Trilliant Talks. I'm your host, Indy Alwalia, and I'm delighted to navigate the dynamic world of pharmacovigilance and risk management with you. But first, as traditional, a quick disclaimer. The opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the individual guests and do not necessarily reflect the official views of Trilliant Consulting or indeed their own company. We're all about fostering insightful conversations here at Trilliant Talks, and we want you to know that any product, vendor or service mentioned does not imply an endorsement. If you're seeking professional advice for specific situations, we encourage you to go to our experts. Please remember this podcast content is meant for informational and educational purposes only. So today, I'm so excited because we have Sabura Matthews, who is Head of Digital Strategy at Global Patient Safety Operations at Takeda, as our guest speaker. Sabura, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Indy.
So, as is tradition with this podcast, I have to ask, how did you get into PV?
So, my story is a little bit different, but not so much. So, like a lot of people in PV, I started out as a clinician. I know a lot of folks are, clinicians, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and the like. So, I started out my career as a registered nurse in emergency medicine and critical care. So, I started out as a trauma nurse, working in the emergency rooms of Philadelphia, really had an opportunity to hone my clinical skill set in that environment, did some time in adult ICU and pediatric ICUs, also in the Philadelphia area at the Children's Hospital and University of Pennsylvania, Albert Einstein Medical Center, several large, level 1, trauma centers and teaching hospitals. So that was the start of my career. And I felt, very secure in terms of my clinical expertise and my knowledge. And then I got to the point, and I'll be very frank, I got to the point as a lot of nurses do, you start to look at what's next in your career. For me, it was a point of time in healthcare when, we were working very short-staffed, to be quite honest. And, in such a critical environment, we saw all types of patients. Like I said, I was able to get, lots of experience, but it was extremely stressful. I enjoyed working with my colleagues, and the way that, I say we were able to make it through is we worked really well as a team. But I started to look and see like, well, what's the next thing? What else can I do? What else is next? Do I go back to school? Do I do something completely different? And, coming out of nursing school, there wasn't this really big push about like, oh, what else can you do? Here are these other things that you can do with your nursing degree. And so I hadn't known anything in detail about pharma beyond, pharmaceutical sales. That's what a lot of people on the hospital side, a lot of clinicians who've never had experience to pharma, they know pharmaceutical sales because they have that exposure to the sales reps, right? Especially back then. So I started out, going to, different informational fairs, job fairs, and, started to bump into people who were, presenting these different types of opportunities within the industry that was beyond, a sort of a pharmaceutical sales position. And so my first role or foray into industry was actually in clinical data management. So I worked in clinical data management at, I'm going to date myself a bit, at the SmithKline Beecham in Collegeville. And, I really enjoyed that because I had an opportunity to not only learn about, clinical trials, the industry in general, it was sort of my foot in the door, and I kind of, expanded from there. But if I can just take a step back a bit, I'm this registered nurse, but I've always, even before I went into nursing school, considered myself to be a bit of a geek. I always had an affinity for, playing around with computers and databases and things like that when I was younger. So I really enjoyed working in clinical data management because we got to do coding, we got to work with the database and set up the databases and do all these different types of things where I was able to use my clinical knowledge, my medical knowledge, but kind of had a little bit of an opportunity to play that geek part, right? So, working with the databases and things like that. And then from there, and I went in as a consultant or a contractor, if you will. And that's when I learned about, contracting and things like that. And as a lot of nurses do, I worked at SmithKline Beecham as a contractor, but I still was doing nursing as well, working night shift and working day shift, because I wasn't sure if this was going to be a real thing, if I really wanted to give up my nursing, okay, well, let's try this pharma thing and see if it goes. And so then as I got into SmithKline Beecham, I started to learn more about the industry and all the various parts of industry, learning more about clinical trials, working within clinical data management, but then being able to have an opportunity to liaise with the safety team. And that really intrigued me because, especially at the time, I felt like, I wanted to go into safety because I felt like that would really give me an opportunity to really utilize my clinical skill in my way of thinking. I used it when I was in data management, but, working in safety, I could almost felt like a closer connection to be able to, work towards the safety of patients, to be, having that adverse event reporting aspect to things. And so then I started to learn and network and see, well, what did I have to do to go into the safety space? And so, again, I went to Icon Clinical Research, which is a CRO that's still around, and really had an opportunity to learn the safety space. And as you probably know, working at a CRO, you really get to get your hands into everything. So, was able to work in the safety space, learn about, aggregate reporting, processing cases. I still was able to help build databases because I got pulled on to work with the clinical data group, working with the CRAs, training the CRAs, and, all these different types of aspects of safety. So that's, was the start of my career. And from there, I sort of just progressed forward working at, different companies and had an opportunity to work at AstraZeneca. I worked at Pfizer at the time when, Lipitor was being launched and Viagra was being launched, and just really
interesting time at Pfizer.
It was a very interesting time at Pfizer, and I worked in the New York office, so I actually commuted up on the train from the Philadelphia area. So I commuted up on the train to Philadelphia because I thought it was a really good opportunity, and it was. So I was really able to learn a lot, and I say from each position, I've actually been able to take more and more knowledge, have more and more experience, just really hone my skills in the safety space. And to be very frank, again, some of my, I have 2 children, and some of my moves were very strategic in terms of like, okay, what do I want to do next in my career? And others were very practical in terms of like, what's best for the family. So if you were to look at my CV, you can see, you might almost say, well, why did she go there? But it was kind of trying to always balance, gaining more knowledge, gaining more experience, moving my career forward, but also making sure that I was in the right space and the right time for my family commitments and things like that. And so that's sort of the clinical phase, coming into my career from working as a nurse. And then moving into what I call my operational phase, kind of getting that foundational experience working across the CROs and the different pharmaceutical companies. And then I had an opportunity to work in consulting. So I worked with the Accenture team. I was pulled into an opportunity as an extension of another team working with Accenture. And so I worked on a team that was, if I can say it's out there, the first team to set up a outsourced pharmacovigilance model in Chennai, India, which then became Accenture's pharmaceutical or pharmacovigilance center of excellence. So stayed in India for 10 months, and Accenture had an agreement with BMS or a partnership with BMS So we went in and worked with the Accenture team and BMS to kind of create a package that we would the team in Chennai. And we trained up, clinicians, doctors, nurses, people who had really, a lot of them never had done safety before, and took them from, the very beginning of learning of like, what is an AE, what is a single case report versus an aggregate report. It was a very like step through, so, and we at the end of that time period, that 10 months, presented that package back to BMS with a team, an actual team, functional team of people who were able to process cases, do medical review, write aggregate reports. And so I was part of that team. And for that particular team, I trained on all aspects, but I was the aggregate reporting lead for that particular initiative. So, that sort of, kicked off my opportunities to do consulting. And I worked with Accenture for a bit, had an opportunity after Accenture, work with Potney Life Sciences. And then I went back to Accenture as a regular employee in a consulting role. So, like I said, for each period of my career, I've taken pieces and had building blocks. So I have my clinical foundation, I have the operational foundation where I've had the hands-on experience, training on cases, writing aggregate reports and doing all these different things. And then in the consulting space, being able to advise and, on best practice and things like that. And then I came back into working with companies after working with the consulting, doing system implementations, process, improvement initiatives, and different things like consultants do. And then have come back to the space where I am now, sort of the role that I say I like to play, or the nuance that I bring is, having being a nurse, understanding the clinical aspects and the medical aspects of safety, having the operational hands-on experience to really deep dive into, how to do things. And, that hands-on experience, I think is essential because it helps you, particularly in the consulting space, to really be able to go in and drill down to something not just on the surface layer, but to really, when you need to troubleshoot things, you can say things your experience of you did things in. I'm getting a. Oh, are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay, you went away for, it was like spinning for a sec.
It might be me. Oh God.
I can hear you now. I couldn't hear you for a second. Yeah, so using that hands-on experience to inform the roles in consulting, and then now coming back into working at pharmaceutical companies. I recently left Bayer, and and I'm with Takeda now, and having that experience, that wealth and depth of experience, to be able to pull on all those different aspects, help me be someone who can, sort of liaise with the IT parts of the organization, the business parts of the organization, and advise on these aspects. Because one of the things that we started to see was these huge initiatives that companies would have. And it would always surprise me that you would go into a company, there's all these millions of dollars being spent to, roll out a tool or a system. And, you have the business that has one, expectation. And then, the IT, the guys that are helping to build the tool. And then a lot of times you would, sit in the room and realize that the people were talking past one another. And you get to the end of the rollout of the implementation. And then the business is saying like, well, this is not what we asked for. And IT is saying, well, this is what you asked for. So I've been oftentimes able to play the role to kind of sit in between to help facilitate these types of implementations, whether it be a system implementation, a process implementation, to kind of help move things forward, to make sure all the pieces are connecting the way that they should be. So that's I think that's a nice summary without being too long-winded. I've been around for some years. I've probably got 20 some plus years of experience in across industry and in healthcare. So.
I mean, I think you have brushed past some of your career I agree. That's an amazing. You have had an amazing career, and actually, if you were to see your CV, I think it is a very impressive CV of companies that you've worked for and roles that you have done. However, I have a very interesting question for you right now,
Sure.
which is, do you think you could have had the career that you've had so far if you were starting off your PV career now?
I think it would have been very different. It's interesting because I just had a conversation with someone the other day, who also has extensive experience, and we were just discussing how different things are now versus back in the old days, and how with the outsourcing model, ensuring that you have the depth of experience to be able to oversee your outsource vendors, and being able to really understand the process in that level of detail. So to answer your question, I think it would have been very different. I think there's a lot to be said for the if I can say, the bumps and bruises and scars of having gone through, coming up through the ranks and really, working with people, and leaders and managers who were like very, very specific about how they wanted their narrative. I've joked with people from, who've been in the industry for years. We'll often talk about like, I remember back when it's like, it was all about the narrative. You had to have this fabulous narrative, and just really understanding the nuances and the things that, having that hands-on experience. I think it would have been very different if I started now. I like to think that I would have strategically found a way to kind of get into the roles that would allow me to build on all the skills that I think I have with, I'm not a programmer or an engineer by any means, but I definitely have an affinity for technology, being able to see things strategically, these are all parts of a skill set that I think would probably help to inform this kind of role. But I think it would have been very different had I been coming into PV now, just because the model is very different from what it was 20 years ago coming into industry.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the fact that you said model almost immediately. This whole vendor outsourcing model that's there. I think there's a new nuance, and the new nuance is AI is going to solve everything, and the problem is that there are a lot of I'd like to say junior people who, because of the vendor outsourcing model, are stuck. They're stuck because they can't move to another area. So if you're case processor, you are just a case processor. And I'm talking about maybe not the massive outsourcing in a different country. I'm talking about local, sort of maybe smaller CROs, or even local global resources as well. They're pigeonholed into such a position that they can't move on and they can't learn. And I look at my career and I think, well, how would I move on now? And I think I would have found the same difficulty that there currently is. And I don't know if this is going to cause a problem in the future of PV. And I don't know if it's, like I said, I don't know if it's just the rambling thoughts of a bearded guy, or if it's actually a serious issue that is going to become an even bigger issue in the future.
I think it's something to think about. I think you bring up a good point. And I think there are, a couple of things, right? Saying that you have, people who, because of the new model and things like that, for whatever different reasons, whether it's outsourcing or something else, who maybe feel stuck. And I think, one of the things that I would tell people, and it's not always easy to do, but, just to really think about, how they used to tell us in school, like, oh, what's your 5-year plan? Where do you want to be in 5 years? it sounds very cliche, but like, think about, for someone that's in that space, right, that says like, oh my God, I want to do something different. I want to learn different. I think it's a conversation. I think, it does depend on the organization and your upward leadership. But, you have to take control of your own career as well. Right. So look, go to industry events if you can, go to, podcasts, things that, things can be expensive, find free things. That's what I consider myself to be a constant learner. I'm always learning, always seeking to look at, what are the new things. I like to be, I call it being very strategic because it's something I've always done. Trying to say like, okay, well, let me stay ahead of the curve. What's the next thing coming? And so that's what I would advise to people. Like, okay, you have your job, you're in case processing. The job is the job, and that's the paycheck. But, speak to your leadership, speak to your manager about like, hey, I'd like to learn something new, something different. Like I said, it depends on the organization. Every organization may not have this opportunity, but like, is there an opportunity to shadow? You still do your regular job, but, hey, can I go and sit with this person to see what they do to learn, right? You have to kind of take advantage if you feel stuck, look at the opportunities, within your organization, and then look at those opportunities outside the organization. Companies like yours, have podcasts, jump into those podcasts and listen to see what's coming. I'm an avid reader, read, now we have everything that's, it's a consumption, world, you have so much stuff coming at you. But you can filter out things that you think are good for you to be able to learn and provide, details in your career. I give my kids the same advice. My son's in college and, he's, wants to go into this computer science career. And, he's just starting out. But I said, you always want to be someone who has that extra something to offer. Stay ahead of the curve. Look to see where the trends are. Is there something you can go and get certified in that you think may benefit you to move to the next step? So it can be frustrating with the new model. I think it's something that we have to, be cautious of, having people be pigeonholed because, it's always more beneficial when you have people who are cross-trained. And can do different things, in case you have someone that's out or whatever, it's all about, being able to backfill and, move fluidly if you need to through an organization. And then you also want to have people feel like they have an opportunity to learn and move up and advance. I had a manager years ago when I worked at Pfizer. And one of the things that she said to me is that, as a manager, it's my job to make sure that you're building on your career and you're developing capabilities to move you forward, even if that moves you forward beyond where I am. And so I've always taken that with me. Right. And thought about that, when I've had people that I've managed or, people that I speak to, it's always a thing, it's like you want to, as a leader, you want to be able to encourage people to develop and move on if they need to. And then as an individual, you want to take responsibility for your career and look for opportunities within your organization for not just next roles, but learning. And same thing, look outside the organization, at these different industry opportunities and be open to looking at, if you're interested in case processing, and you want to follow that track and, you maybe want to go to aggregate reports, that's fine too. But also looking now, we're in this digital world, looking to see what's coming forward, what kind of opportunities. One of the things that I did early on in my career, I had my, my regular case processing roles, but I would always raise my hand to volunteer for different kinds of stuff, different projects and things that might not be a part of the day to day. And sort of that's how I started learning about, project management and things like that years ago. And then went on and got, my project management certification and, sort of started to be able to move that forward. So that's also a skill in the toolbox that can be pulled forward. So it's lots of different things. You always have to be kind of looking and searching. And it can be tiresome because there's so much stuff out here, right? And then I think you talked about the AI was, the other question is how, everybody thinks that the AI is going to solve all the next best things. It's going to be the next best thing. And I think we as an industry have to be cautious because there's always these buzzwords. I think a few years, and not that there aren't good aspects. I think there are good opportunities, but I think a few years ago, data, what was it?
Data
was it big data? Big
Oh,
data.
big data.
Big
Yeah,
data
yeah.
was the buzzword, right? And everybody was like, "Ooh, what do we do? How do we, data warehouse it? What do we do?" And so there's definitely things to be developed and pulled from that, but you have to be careful. We have to be careful as an industry that we think that here's a buzzword, big data, AI, this, that, it's going to just solve everything, because we still have to be able to really have an understanding of what our needs are and where we're trying to go. A tool is not just going to fix something because we digitize it. We have to look at the process and look at to see like where we're really going, and what the need is before we just start throwing tools at things and calling it digital.
So, again, looking back at your career, you've worked for big companies, small companies, huge companies, massive companies, and sort of middle companies as well. You've had a career where you were a consultant, you've worked outside of industry, inside of industry, around industry. I mean, it's a fantastic career. One of the things that obviously has been a big, marker of your whole career has been vendors, and either setting up vendors or reviewing vendors or managing vendors. Do you think the outsourcing model works? And does it work unilaterally for everyone, or does it work for specific situations?
I think there's definitely a place for outsourcing, right? Because it started with, a way to, extend your organization, increase efficiencies, decrease costs, right? That was the biggest driver. I think there's definitely a place for outsourcing. And I think there's an opportunity for everyone. And maybe not to make it so absolute to say everyone. Most companies, I think there's an opportunity for outsourcing. I think if you look at it on like a continuum of, companies who, want to maintain, some control, and they'll outsource a little bit. You have to look at your organization. You have to look at how it would work for you. So you have companies who they say, oh, I want to maintain some control. We'll outsource, some of our older products maybe, and let outsource the outsource model work for those types of products. And we'll see how things go. And then you have companies who've gone all the way to the other end of the continuum, and they outsource everything. And I think you have to be cautious, because I think a company should still, within reason. And I guess I'm thinking like, big company, big resources. It may be different for a company that has, 5 people, they have to outsource, to adjust for volume and things like that. But you have to be careful outsourcing everything, because that's when you get into a situation where, do the people internally who have, ultimate responsibility for, for the products, the process, do they really know what's going on in detail? Can they get into a room and really drill down with the level of expertise that they need, to solve any issues that come up? Or are they completely dependent on the outsource provider? And I think there has to be a good marriage between the two. And so, I definitely think there's the role for outsourcing for everyone. There's an opportunity, but it's nuanced. But I do caution, going too far to the other side of the continuum, where you outsource everything, give up all the control, and you get into a sort of a comfort space of just overseeing things and not really being able to put your finger on the pulse of things if your questions are asked. I think we have to be cautious of that.
I think that's a really fair point that you brought up there about understanding and control. I think there are a lot of companies that, you're right, give up complete control and not even understand their own process. I think there is maybe a bit of a naivety when it comes to vendor outsourcing sometimes, that, it's your process. It's not the outsourced vendor's process. It is your process that they are following. And instead of managing hundreds of people, you're essentially managing one company, but it's the same thing. How you would manage those hundreds of people is the way that you manage that company. Is that a fair thing?
I think so. And I'd also add too, just, kind of stepping out of the outsource discussion and going into the process piece that you mentioned. I think it's also important for companies to really not just look at their outsourcing models and how much they're outsourcing and, having control, but like looking internally and looking at their processes, periodically. I think especially some of the larger companies can get bogged down, right? We've, industries changed from 20 years ago, regulations have changed, technology has changed. And, the core process of safety case processing is the same. But, we've got these systems and these add-on systems, and then we add on processes, and you start to kind of tag on to the different processes. And I think it's good to kind of take a step back and do a process evaluation, if you will, like internally, and I'm not saying like, run out and get consultants. Of course, they're very good at that. They can come do that and help you streamline, but really just kind of take a step out so that you don't stagnate on the process and make sure that the process makes sense, right? So you're not just, having technology drive the process because, I got this new technology, we're going to add this piece to the process. And then if you really took a step back and you say like, that doesn't make sense, or it's overly cumbersome, I think it's good to just do that evaluation internally from time to time. And I think that's something that some companies don't always do because you get there, you've been there for years and it works, or you think it, works, or even if it doesn't work, well, this is what we've always done. So we don't want to shake the boat. We don't want to, go through that whole big thing. I think, just kind of keeping things fresh and making sure that, you are looking at the new technology, not allowing technology to drive everything, but looking at new technology. But I think the process is a core piece that we need to stay on top of and make sure that it doesn't get overly bulky because you've added all these new systems or regulation changes, and you have to, accommodate with a system or a new process for the regulation. Make sure you can keep it as streamlined as possible. Because then it becomes overly complicated for the case processors, right? And the people actually doing the work. If you have, all these different, sort of arms or avenues or nuances, and if this, then that, sometimes that can't be avoided. But other times, when you think about like, as a person who's done the work, it becomes so cumbersome that you have to now you've created all these, extra, work practices. And if like, if this scenario, people have to go up and look up like 3 or 4 or 5 different documents before they can process one case. And so I'm just saying like, keep it, if you can help keep it streamlined, go to the cost discussion. That also will help keep costs down too, right? Because if you start making things overly cumbersome, overly bulky, people have to refer to multiple documents to be able to process one case, it can lead to, case processing times being extended. And if you want to go into all those different avenues. So, I think it's, look at the outsourcing model. I think there's definitely opportunity there, but, be cautious because, as the, you own the process, not the outsource provider, and, and look at your own processes as well. I guess is the summation of that.
I think you brought up another good point then with technology. And I know in your recent career and potentially your current role, technology plays a big part, and you, maybe I'm boiling this down a little bit too much, and I apologize if I'm making it oversimplified. But you essentially were almost internally managing large-scale projects, right? And were you disappointed with some of the outcomes? Not because of the way that the project was run necessarily, but by promises made by vendors or things that you had thought about at the beginning of the project. And again, I'm guessing these are large-scale, multi-year projects. And how things change from the promises at the beginning, yes, we can do this, yes, we can do this, yes, we can do this, to near the end where it's like, well, I don't remember us discussing this. Was this in the requirements? Like, how have you dealt with all of that? And do you think there's a massive change in recent years with these large-scale projects?
So, yes, is is the short answer. So I've been lucky enough. So I managed large scale projects, and I think if you go to anyone who's worked in industry, who's worked on technology projects in particular, on a large scale, you've had experiences with a vendor, not any particular vendor, a vendor, where, and not even saying that this is their intention, right? But where, you go in, you think, you're gathering requirements and things like that. And then you get to the end and, it's just like, this, things changed. And there's lots of reasons for that. Sometimes some of the projects I've worked on, have been, large, not just large scale projects, but complex, right? Because you have all these different inputs. You have, your technology landscape within your organization, so what does that look like? You have your processes that, feed into, they conjoin to be a part of that ecosystem. And then you have, the regulatory impact that's coming in. And so that's, in the last years I've seen, is something that's really been impacting the projects in particular, is, really trying to, have that regulatory intelligence and, have your finger on the pulse of, what are the regulators going to do in any particular region. And then trying to ensure that not only are you going to be compliant from a regulatory perspective and that your process is going to be able to meet those requirements, but then your technology is going to be able to work to meet those compliance requirements. And, as I'm sure you guys have seen, you have these different, initiatives that roll out from the different regulators. And they said, okay, by this date, you have to be able to, submit these types of reports, or, the system has to be able to do this. And so then you go to your vendor, and they, they're also trying to stay on top of the, the regulatory requirements that are coming from the agencies, right? And so, there's times where I, having done this, and you have to kind of step back and, you could sit and be mad and be like, oh, they told us they were going to do this, but also giving them a little bit of grace too, because when you really sit down and talk to some of those large vendors and realize, like, yeah, they're also having conversations with the regulators, and they're also trying to figure out, what they need to do to be compliant, and also realizing that these things, that's the frustrating part. Like, you got the regulators, and we're all, trying to make sure we're compliant. That's the big thing. But technology doesn't shift. Technology of a certain size in particular doesn't shift on a dime. So the vendors who are, saying that, we were disappointed because, oh, yeah, they said this was going to be, ready by this, first quarter this year. And, oh, they didn't have it. But then when you sit down and you have those conversations and, you realize they're trying to shift their system to meet the requirements, but then the requirements aren't fully finalized by the agency. So it's, so it's like, this whole cycle. So, like I said, the short answer is yes. Like, yes, I've run large projects, where we've gotten to the end, or we've worked with a vendor. We said, like, you know what, that's not really what we promised. And we've all worked with different vendors, and you start to know, okay, who you would like to work with on certain projects. And I've been lucky enough to work with some really good vendors, who, you work with a vendor on an initiative, and you realize, like, okay, this is a good partner, and you can move that partner forward that, that has the capabilities to do these different types of things. And so that's something that you can keep in your toolbox as someone who's managing these large projects, right? And who your go-to vendors are when you need to do certain things, and who in the past has delivered accurately and on point, and to contract, if you will, who's done what they say they're going to do, right? And so I think it's I give grace to the vendors sometimes, because I realize it's not simple. But also you have to also hold them accountable too. You have to know, and this is where it comes, where, knowing up front, gathering good requirements, knowing your process, and, making sure your process is good, right? We as the owners of the process have some responsibility to make sure, we're what we're asking, makes sense. And that there's a discussion between, the vendors, the process owners, in terms of, having that conversation of like, well, this is what we want to do. Can you do it? And then some onus on the vendors to say, not just to say because they want the check, oh yeah, we can do it. to get the contract, to get the work. Having a realistic conversation, I think is from my perspective is appreciated. To let's sit down and really have a conversation. Like, this is what we're trying to do. Here's our process. Here's our current technology landscape. Can you help us do X, Y, and Z? And, if we move forward with this project, making sure that you have the right people, that's also key, right? On these different large scale projects, on the front end, from the business side, making sure you have the right SMEs and making sure all the key people are in the room, making sure the questions are being asked and making sure you're gathering good requirements. And you'll gather good requirements if you have good people, if you have not good people, but the right people, the right SMEs in the room. So then when you get downstream, you're giving the vendors something that they can also work with, but it has to be a good partnership there.
I have one more question before we get to our last question, so penultimate question. But it came up in what you were just saying there, which is about requirements and having the right people in the room. Is there, and this, it goes a bit left as well. In recent years, I would say more and more in recent years, there is a control of where you can get either your vendor from or how you run a project. Because especially with technology, the companies, what they'll do is the budget for that is held within the IT group. Now, what that means is that if, and I'm talking about, from if you wanted to bring a new vendor in, you can't, because for that specific experience that you're talking about, say it's just one person, it might just be one person that you want to bring in. But because they're not on that approved vendor list, you have to go through whoever it is. And it might be a big consultancy firm. It might be someone who are a big finance consultancy firm and actually have nothing to do with life sciences. And then also on top of that, you've got this pressure from IT, which is saying, well, we don't care that you want to potentially go to another software vendor or another process vendor or something, because they're not on our approved list. How do you deal with that?
So, disclaimer, it ultimately depends on the company and the environment and if they're open. But, one of the ways to deal with that is, and one of the ways I dealt with it in the companies I've worked with, and we were lucky enough to have the structures, set up where we could have a relationship with IT. So, like you're saying, you have these projects that are funded, of a certain amount that are funded through IT, and maybe a portion is, funded through PV, however the combination goes, however it goes, where it's fully IT funded or it's partially PV funded or fully PV funded, depending on the project. I think in those instances, like I said, it depends on the company if they're open, but if there's a vendor that you want to go to that's not on the approved list, and you've worked with vendors before and have had this scenario happen, that, we worked with them before. We've had challenges, multiple times. Things didn't go well. They didn't deliver, but yet they're still on the list. And so we're still being told we have to work with this particular person. I think what we did was we made a business case to be able to work with a particular vendor. And in our case, this vendor had a particular, skill set, nuance. It was a small firm. And, we went, and because, we had a relationship with IT, we got the support of our leadership. We started with, with our internal PV leadership to say, like, hey, this is what we want to do. In our case, it was something that was, being driven by new regulations that were coming in. So we had a little bit of, extra oomph. The vendors that we had worked with previously, didn't necessarily have the extensive or deep bench and knowledge and skill set that they would have needed to have to address this particular need that we were trying to go to. So that was one instance. And we made the case. We said, hey, listen, this is the experience we've had before with this vendor. This is what we would need them to do. Do we think that they're capable of doing this? They can do probably a portion of that work. But here's this other company that has this experience. They have this deep bench. They've done this kind of work. They know the nuances of this is of what we're trying to do. And then, and again, it also always comes down to cost. So, looking at the cost of the different vendors. And this is where it helps when you have that experience. So when you see, a proposal come through, if you have the level of experience, you can kind of call BS. If somebody's telling you, we're going to do this for, these little bit of dollars, and it's going to be wonderful and it's going to be fabulous. You kind of have to know where to go and to look to say, I've worked with you before. I know how you do business. And I know that's not really going to cost what you're saying it's going to cost if you're going to really do it the right way. Mm-hmm. And so, being able to ask those questions, and then, when you're trying to have an argument to bring a new vendor on board, putting that into your business case to support, like, these guys are here, they're on the master list. And, if you have a good relationship with IT, you can say like, hey, we know this space. We know these particular vendors. We know the vendors that you're trying to push us towards, you may have this master service agreement or whatever, are not really going to help us do what we need to do. And again, in our case, several cases that I had, they were sort of regulatory driven. So we had an extra little oomph to be able to say, we would like to go with these vendors. And so there's different ways that you can work around it. And at the end of the day, they may just have a model that they just aren't, a company may say, this is who we're going to have to use, and you have to work with these people. But I've seen that a lot as well. Where, you're being pushed to go to a particular vendor, even if they don't have the expertise, but they're on that master list. And so that's one of the ways that I would go about trying to do to see if we could bring a new vendor on board. It may work, it may not work, but it's always worth to try to be able to build up that case. And those are some of the things that you can utilize to try to push your point forward. And, having those partnerships in IT, relationship, building is important, so that when you need to go and you need to talk to someone, you have a person that you can talk to who is going to listen, right? Who you at least have a relationship to say, let me explain my point. And then, support from your leadership. I had real excellent leadership, in previous roles, who on the PV side, who was always open to listen, and then move that fight forward if we needed to the higher levels. So, yeah.
I think that's a really good point that you brought out, and it's been a fascinating conversation. But we're coming to the end of the podcast, and the podcast is called Innovation and the Future of Pharmacovigilance. Yeah. So, Sabura, what's next in PV?
I think the world is our oyster, right? I think right now you're hearing AI is the buzzword, digital is the buzzword. I think there are lots of new tools, coming forward to help make PV case processing, reporting, analytics, risk management, all of those things, more efficient and cost effective. One of the things I think, and I guess I would end with this, is to look towards the future. I think companies really should take a step back and kind of look at their organizations and look to see, kind of, do almost an assessment of where the needs really are, where the efficiencies can be gained, where there are opportunities to make improvements with, digital technology, not just AI, and not just sort of, kind of going out to try to find AI tools because it looks cool and it looks, it's hot and sexy, and just kind of trying to put that over top of, a PV organization. I think, a lot of companies, should really take the time to, outside of the day-to-day, if they have the people and the resources to really look at their processes, make sure the foundation is sound, and do that assessment, understand, where there are some really true needs for operational efficiency, cost savings, streamlining, and how the digital tools and technology can help with that. And then also, being aware. I mean, there's new stuff coming out all the time. The vendors, people are, creating their own tools and customizations and things like that. But, having people within the organization that keep their pulse on what technologies are out there and how they would be a good fit for their particular organization. Because, what works for company A and company B may not be a good fit for company C. So.
Sabura, it's been an amazing conversation with you. I thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Indy.